in the autopsy, so the Dr. Gruesome is not here today. So I will be reading the coroner's report. If any of you have trouble hearing me give the coroner's report, there are two lovely brunette ladies who will be standing over near 2nd Street who will have written copies of the coroner's report to pass out at the end of this reading. Okay, here is the preliminary coroner's report that Dr. Gruesome has prepared. No, ma'am, I cannot turn it up. This is as loud as it goes. I'm trying to project and still not make the microphone go crazy.
It's louder over here.
Yes, I know. I've dealt with this microphone before. Okay, regarding the unattended death of Stone Fisher, a resident of Hollywood, California. In the dark and sleepy hour of 2:30 a.m. on Friday morning, February 24th, I, Gus Gruesome, received a phone call from Officer Polygraph, that's me, of the Langley Police Department. Officer Graff informed me, Gus Gruesome, not me, that she had been called to investigate the report of a dead gorilla near the Langley post office. When she arrived on the scene, she immediately realized that the large, hairy figure in the grass was not a gorilla or a Sasquatch, but a very tall, muscular person in a Wookiee costume. I asked her what a Wookiee was. She was startled, but she said she would enlighten me later. She told me that she had removed the mask from the costume body, but could not identify the man, so it was not a local person. I stumbled out of bed and kissed my wife, Gussie, and threw on a lab coat and fired up my trustworthy old sedan, and I drove to the morgue on Dead Goat Road to pick up the coroner wagon. When I arrived at the scene of the crime, it was very silent and dark on 2nd Street. I examined the deceased and agreed with Officer Graff that the man was indeed dead. Dr. Gruesome is not a good typer. She asked if I wanted her to call IB Fuzz and get her down to help with the investigation of the crime scene. It was cold, it was dark. I wanted nothing more than to crawl back under my down comforter, so I told Officer Graff not to call Detective Fuzz at 3 a.m. in the morning. Let the old girl sleep, because she couldn't see much in the middle of the night, and tramping around the crime scene might disturb evidence. So I instructed Officer Graff to secure the crime scene and guard it until I returned at sunrise. Trust me, folks, I had already worked a 10-hour shift. I did not want to guard the crime scene all night. Anyway, I assured Officer Graff that I would call Detective Fuzz in the morning when I came back to the crime scene after sunrise. The officer and I then carried the body to the coroner's wagon. Just as we were loading the poor man into the back, bakery owner Betty Talker walked by on her way to start the wood fire ovens for her baking that day. She seemed overly interested, but I informed her that this was an ongoing investigation and we could not speak until the next of kin had been notified. I certainly was not going to identify to the unofficial village voice what had happened and who the body might be, even if I had known who it was. That woman, Betty Talker, hears something and the whole town knows it within an hour. There are very few secrets in a small town. Getting back to the morgue, I stashed the body in the refrigerator and drove home for a few more hours of sleep. I returned to the crime scene at 6 a.m., at which time I called Detective Fuzz and informed her that we could use her help at a crime scene. Officer Graff and I began to collect evidence. The first thing we noticed was several large footprints in the grass leading from the Saratoga Inn parking lot to where the body had fallen. I found an odd-looking yellow dart and several melting marshmallows, scattered around the path from behind the Saratoga Inn to 2nd Street where the body was discovered. Near the body was a bag containing some Macintosh apples, several mushrooms, some morels, some chanterelles, a couple shaggy manes. Officer Graff showed me where she had thrown the mask that she removed from the victim so that she realized it was a person in a costume. It was an ugly latex thing. As I lifted it with my gloved hands, I noticed that it was dusted with a white powder on the inner surface of the mask. I swabbed the mask to sample the powder, but I did not want to transport it in my vehicle until I could identify what the powder was. So I left the mask at the scene of the crime, which was roped off by by Officer Graff. Just then, a white Toyota sedan screeched to a halt, and a very angry little woman stepped out. Detective Fuzz stormed over to Officer Graff and started shouting. Fuzz may be small, but she is a mighty big temper when she's crossed. I was attempting to explain that it was I who had decided to let her get her beauty sleep until daylight, but she continued to shout at Officer Graff until Detective Fuzz's cousin, Hagatha Kisty, climbed out of the other side of the Toyota and tried to separate Graff and IB Fuzz. When all three women were calmed down, I told Officer Graff to continue guarding the scene, and I asked Detective Fuzz to accompany me to the morgue. Miss Kisty said that she was going to go walk her dog and then go get a cup of coffee. At the morgue, Detective Fuzz assisted me with the body since my sweet wife had already gone to Seattle. First thing we noticed when we took the body out of the refrigerator was that his face was covered with a fine red rash. I told Fuzz I suspected it might be a reaction to the powder I found inside the mask. I assured her I would be sending that substance to CSI, which is Coupeville Scientific Investigations, for identification. Until we knew what the powder was, I photographed the victim's face and then wrapped his head in plastic. Can't let that powder get in the air. Upon removing the furry costume, I found that it was a Caucasian male, over 6 feet 6 inches tall, with well-developed musculature. There was no obvious wound on the body, neither gunshot nor knife wound. The bones were not broken. His hands also had a small amount of rash on them, so I bagged those. If we cannot identify the victim around town, we will send his fingerprints to Coupeville. I drew blood and snipped hairs, the man's, not the costumes, and collected other trace evidence. Detective Fuzz stuffed the costume into an evidence bag, and as I prepared the samples for CSI, I was collecting some fuzz clinging to the chest hair when I noticed a very small puncture wound right over the heart. I also found swelling and rash inside the mouth of the victim. No immediate obvious cause of death has been determined at the time of this preliminary report. We are awaiting the results of the forensic tests from Coupeville. I hope to have a final autopsy report ready on Sunday. In the meantime, Detective Fuzz went into town and circulated the victim's photo around Langley. The victim was identified as Stone Fisher, president of the International Society of Science Fiction, Arts, and Technology, better known as ISFAT. The convention is being held at the Inn at Langley. The widow, Sherry Fisher, seemed quite distraught when I informed her of her husband's death on Friday morning. I released Officer Graff from her guard duty after the day shift of the police department arrived. Detective Fuzz hopes to wrap up her investigation by February 26th in the late afternoon, She will announce the findings at the Langley Middle School auditorium at 5 p.m. Sunday evening. This completes the coroner's report. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Woo!